On Christmas Eve 1945, an ordinary American family went to bed, never imagining that within a few hours their lives would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Then, their home caught fire. The parents escaped. So did four of their children, but five were still trapped inside. The house burned for hours, and when the flames finally died down, people began searching for the bodies. What they found made no sense. There weren't any, not one. No human remains, no bones, no evidence that the five children had ever died in that house. So here's the question. If they didn't burn to death, where did they go? Today, I want to tell you the story of the Sodder family. A story that began as a tragic house fire, but quickly became a mystery that has remained unsolved for nearly 80 years. To understand why this story still raises so many questions, we first need to meet the Sodder family. George and Jenny Sodder lived in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. George had been born in Italy before immigrating to the United States as a teenager. Over the years, he built a successful trucking business and earned a reputation as a hardworking businessman in the community. By the mid-1940s, the Sodders were living comfortably in a large house on the edge of town. George and Jenny were raising 10 children. Their home was rarely quiet. There was always someone laughing, someone helping with chores, or someone getting ready for school. To their neighbors, the Sodders looked like any other American family. There was, however, one thing that made George stand out. He never hid his political opinions. George was openly critical of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government in Italy. His views often led to heated arguments. On more than one occasion, those arguments turned into threats. At the time, no one thought much of it. Then came December of 1945. Christmas was only hours away. On the evening of December 24th, the Sodder family gathered at home just as they always did. The children were excited, playing with their new Christmas presents. George and Jenny began getting ready for bed. It felt like an ordinary Christmas Eve. At least, that's how it seemed. On the evening of December 24th, 1945, the Sodder home was filled with the warmth and excitement of Christmas. It was the children's favorite time of year. They were opening presents, laughing together, and doing everything they could to stay awake just a little longer. Around 10 o'clock that night, Jenny headed upstairs to bed. Before turning in, she made sure the doors were locked and the lights downstairs had been switched off. Several of the older children went to their rooms as well, but the five youngest begged to stay up a little longer and play with their new toys. Jenny smiled and agreed. She had no way of knowing that this simple decision would change her family's life forever. A little later, at around midnight, the telephone rang. Jenny answered it. A woman she had never spoken to before was on the other end of the line. She asked for someone Jenny didn't recognize. In the background, she could hear laughter and what sounded like a lively party. Jenny told her she must have the wrong number. The woman apologized, and the call ended. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. People dialed the wrong number. It happened. But in the years that followed, that phone call would become one of the most puzzling details of the entire case. Before going back to bed, Jenny noticed something else. The lights were still on downstairs. The curtains hadn't been closed. Usually that meant the younger children were still awake. She turned off the lights, checked the doors one last time, and quietly returned to her bedroom. It was the last time she would ever see the house at peace. Less than an hour later, Jenny was awakened by an unfamiliar sound. It came from the roof, as if something heavy had landed on the house, then rolled across it. A few seconds later, everything was quiet again. Half asleep, she convinced herself it was nothing, closed her eyes, and drifted back to sleep. But only a short time later, it wouldn't be a sound that woke her again. It would be the smell of smoke. It was just after 1 o'clock in the morning when Jenny woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The house was filling with smoke. She jumped out of bed and woke George. By then, flames had already spread across the first floor. Without thinking, they rushed to wake the children. Some of them made it outside almost immediately. Everything happened in a matter of minutes. The smoke grew thicker. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Then George realized something that stopped him cold. 5 of the children were still upstairs. Morris, Martha, Louie, Jenny, and little Betty. None of them had come out. George tried to get back inside, but the staircase was already engulfed in flames. There was no way to reach the second floor, so he ran outside, planning to use the extension ladder that was always kept beside the house. But when he got there, it was gone. The ladder had vanished. With no time to waste, George ran to his trucks. His plan was simple: drive one up beside the house, climb onto the cab, and reach the upstairs window. But then something else happened, something he could never explain. Both trucks, which had been working perfectly earlier that day, refused to start. Not one of them would turn over. By now, the second floor was completely consumed by flames. Neighbors rushed outside. Some tried calling the fire department, but the phone line wasn't working. One neighbor eventually drove into town to report the fire in person. By the time firefighters finally arrived, almost nothing was left of the house. They began searching through the burned remains. Everyone expected them to recover the bodies of the 5 children. Instead, they uncovered another mystery, because buried beneath the ashes, there wasn't a single body. By the following morning, firefighters had finished searching the ruins of the Soder home. The official conclusion was straightforward. The 5 missing children had died in the fire, but almost immediately that explanation began to fall apart. With each passing day, more questions surfaced. The first thing that troubled George and Jenny was the complete absence of human remains. Even after devastating house fires, investigators would normally expect to recover at least fragments of bone. Here, they found nothing. The local coroner insisted that the fire had been so intense it completely cremated the children's bodies. But many experts would later challenge that conclusion, pointing out that an ordinary house fire simply doesn't burn hot enough to destroy human remains without leaving anything behind. Then there was the ladder. George was certain it had always been kept beside the house, yet when he ran outside that night, it had disappeared. It wasn't until later that the ladder was found lying some distance away near an embankment. No one could explain how it got there. The trucks raised even more questions. Both had been running perfectly earlier that day. Yet when George desperately tried to use them to reach the second floor, neither one would start. Strangely enough, both vehicles worked again afterward without requiring any major repairs. The telephone line turned out to be just as mysterious. At first, everyone assumed it had burned in the fire, but investigators later discovered that wasn't true. The wire hadn't melted. It had been cut, not by the flames, but by someone using a tool. A few days later, another witness came forward. He claimed that during the fire, he saw a car parked near the house. According to his account, several children were inside. He couldn't make out their faces, but he was convinced the vehicle drove away long before firefighters arrived. On their own, any one of these details might have been dismissed as coincidence, but when George and Jenny looked at the entire picture, they found themselves asking a question that sounded almost impossible. What if their children had never died in that fire at all? Most people would have eventually accepted what they had been told. George and Jenny Soder couldn't. They were convinced their children had not died in that fire, and they were determined to prove it. In the months that followed, the couple launched their own investigation. They spoke with witnesses, revisited every detail of that night, and searched for anything the official investigation might have missed. The more they learned, the harder it became to believe the official explanation. Then new reports began to emerge. One woman claimed she had seen the 5 children the morning after the fire, riding in a car with 2 unfamiliar men. Another witness said she had served breakfast to several children and 2 adults at a roadside diner around the same time. None of these accounts could ever be verified, but to George and Jenny, they were impossible to ignore. Several years later, George took an extraordinary step. He erected a massive billboard along a busy highway displaying photographs of the 5 missing children, alongside the promise of a substantial reward for anyone who could provide information about what had happened to them. The billboard stood there for years. Thousands of people passed it every day. And before long, the story of the Sodder family had spread far beyond the borders of West Virginia. But perhaps the strangest development came more than 20 years after the fire. One day, the family received a letter containing a photograph of a young man. On the back was a handwritten note. "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, boys, a 90132, or something very close to that." Louis had been one of the 5 missing children. George became convinced the young man in the photograph was his son. Determined to find the truth, he hired a private investigator and sent him to trace where the picture had come from. The investigator left and was never heard from again. By then, more than 20 years had passed since the fire, but for George and Jenny, the story had never truly ended. Decades have passed. The Sodder family home is long gone. The children who survived grew up. New generations came and went. Yet the one question that mattered most has never been answered. So what really happened on Christmas Eve, 1945? Those who support the official explanation believe the 5 children died in the fire, and that the missing remains can be explained by mistakes made during the investigation and the extreme conditions of the blaze. Others believe something far more disturbing, that the fire was never the real tragedy, but only a cover, that the children had been taken before the flames consumed the house. To this day, neither theory has ever been proven. George Sodder died without ever abandoning his belief that his children had survived. Jenny lived for many years after him, holding onto the hope that one day she would finally learn what had happened to her sons and daughters. For her, this was never just an old case. It was an unanswered question she carried for the rest of her life. Today, nearly 80 years later, the disappearance of the Sodder children remains officially unsolved. No one knows whether the 5 children died that night, or somehow escaped the burning house alive. Maybe the truth disappeared along with the people who once knew it. Or maybe it's still out there, waiting to be uncovered in an old photograph, a forgotten document, or a witness whose story has never been fully told. And that's why the story of the Sodder family has never been remembered as just another house fire. It's remembered as one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in American history.